So we were thinking, okay, what is a design we could come up with, which is not a roll up, but which inherits a lot of that efficiency, right? And that's how my co-founder, Willem, who's a cryptographer, came up with the spider chain. So I think when we were designing the spider chain, there were three things that we were really optimizing for, right? So the first is like, what is possible in Bitcoin Core today, right? Because as I mentioned, it's very hard difficult to build on. The second thing is...
Hey everyone, welcome to Talking Tokens, a podcast focused on interviewing the best crypto founders, market players, and up-and-coming startups that are changing the industry every single Tuesday and Thursday. I'm Jacquelyn Melinek, your award-nominated host and former senior crypto reporter turned entrepreneur, and I'm excited to be here with you all. Now, let's get into it. Today's guest is Alisia Painter, Botanix Labs co-founder and COO. Last year, Botanix Labs launched its own Ethereum virtual machine like Bitcoin L2 in an attempt to make it easier to build on the network. If you're lost, don't know what I'm talking about, it's all right. We will get into it. I'm excited to have Alisia on the show. Alisia, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. And before we start talking about Botanix and everything that you guys are building, how did you even get into this space?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm originally Canadian, and my career before crypto was very traditional and very TradFi-y. Mm-hmm. So worked in management consulting for a few years, worked in private equity, M&A. And really interestingly, I worked all over the world. So spent some time living in Asia, all over Africa, and then moved to Latin America. And it was in Brazil in 2015 that actually I first learned about Bitcoin for the first time. So yeah, I moved to Brazil in 2015. And at that time, I think that year, the real had depreciated about 30% in comparison to the USD. And I was attending a bunch of these startup networking events because I wanted to pivot into tech from finance. And really interestingly, Brazil at the time was a massive hub for fintech innovation. So, and actually a lot of the top, fintechs in the world are actually come from Brazil and from emerging markets more generally. Right. Mm-hmm. And so when I was speaking to them, I was like, yeah, this is super interesting. And as someone who had lived and worked in a lot of these emerging markets, I was like really excited about the prospect of fintech, uplifting millions out of poverty and just really and democratizing access to finance. And they were like, well, if this is what you're passionate about, you should really look into Bitcoin. And so that's actually when I read the Bitcoin white paper for the first time was back then, and quickly fell down the rabbit hole on Reddit, went to a bunch of technical meetups in Brazil and in Latin America, and got quite involved in the space, started buying Bitcoin for the first time, and then kind of broadened, my crypto career a little bit further. So, obviously participated in the entire ICO era, was part of DeFi Summer, built my own liquid fund from the ground up, which I was just doing as a hobby on the side, kind of a friends and family fund. And then moved to the United States, I think 6 years ago, to do my MBA at Harvard. That's actually where I met my co-founder. And yeah, been working in crypto more full-time ever since, and at Botanix Lab more specifically for the past year and a half or so.
Amazing. So you've had a pretty big career so far in the crypto space.
I would say yes, but for most of it, I was quite an amateur trader. With a pseudonym on Discord, I pretended to be an older man for most of it. So
why an older man? That's hilarious.
Yeah, that's like my Discord and everything. I think it was good. It helped me.
You could be whoever stealthy. You want. Yeah, everyone is somewhat anonymous in the space from every once in a while. Okay, so you were in a broader crypto space, and now you're focusing more on Bitcoin. Why Bitcoin? It's kind of going back to your roots, or where do you see the vision here?
It's really interesting because I asked, I think, my co-founder the same question when he pitched this idea to me. I was like, really, Bitcoin? That's so 16. And so when we first started chatting, I was quite an ETH maxi because I honestly made most of my money in ETH. I was like a trader and ICO vibes. And so I started, and I think the provocation here is why not Bitcoin, right? And once I started really thinking about it, I was like, yeah, honestly, everything on Ethereum on Bitcoin is 10x bigger. I think you saw that with Ordinals last year, right? Ordinals came out, and within 3 months, it basically had overtaken all of Ethereum NFTs, right? So I think the fact that, one, there's a massive pool of capital that is not potentialized it's a very immediate TAM to address. I think two, it has achieved a level of, mainstream adoption and acceptance that really hasn't been seen by any other cryptocurrency. I mean, to date, as someone, again, who routinely travels to emerging markets and has spent time like across Africa and Latin America, a lot of these folks only use Bitcoin and no other cryptocurrency. Right. So just in terms of that, like mass market acceptance and mainstream adoption, I think nothing can really touch Bitcoin. And three, I think it has proven itself over time to be the best cryptocurrency there is, right? The most decentralized, the most permissionless, the most secure, 100% uptime. I mean, Ethereum comes very, very, very close. Obviously, credit to the entire Ethereum team, but I think nothing really tops the decentralization core that is Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, if you think about what makes Bitcoin great, it comes down to these two things, right? Which is decentralization and the scarcity of the asset class itself. And that's something no other cryptocurrency can really provide. And that's what I think makes it a great base for an actual global decentralized financial system. And, counteract all of the effects we're seeing around the world of, broken monetary and financial and fiscal policy that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the big picture here is if you really think about, what the world is going to look like in 50 or 100 years, right? With Bitcoin as is winning global money, we need to build a lot more applications around it. And that's how we really started thinking about Botanix Labs and how we got to our thesis, which I'm happy to tell you more about.
No, 100%. I was going to say, like, how did Botanix Labs kind of come to its thesis, vision? And then also there is something called the spider chain for our listeners who don't know that is a part of Botanix Labs' core vision, right? And I'll let you explain that better than me because it's basically a decentralized network of multi-sigs, right? But I think we should explain that in layman's terms. If you want to start there, then we could go into kind of the thesis of Botanix.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the thesis first, if that's okay, and then maybe
please.
Work at the spider chain. So I think if we peel it back to the thesis of Botanix Labs like 2 years ago, right? I think 2 years ago, obviously this year, everyone and their mother is spinning up a Bitcoin L2. So we're in a very different environment. But 2 years ago, no one was really building in Bitcoin, right? Our only competitors or comparative, products were Stacks and Rootstock, and massive props to those teams. But they really had not achieved much product market fit back then. Obviously, it's quite different now. But back then, they really did not achieve much product market fit. And so we were trying to figure out, like, what is that missing link? Why isn't there more utility and programmability on Bitcoin-based layer? And I think it comes down to two things. One, Bitcoin is inherently a very adversarial protocol and more resistant to change, and that is by design, right? I think the ossification and the unchangeability of Bitcoin, there are a lot of critics of it, but also it is what has maintained a lot of the stability of the protocol as it is today. And we're actually in favor of more changes, and we can talk about the entire soft fork debate and covenants as the time goes on. But in general, it is a hard protocol to work with. It's a hard protocol to build on, right? It's really interesting. I'm seeing all of these Bitcoin L2 spin up, and I'm like, man, I don't know how they're doing it because it takes like 2 years to ship a testnet. So it's like I'm not sure how they're doing it. But yeah, it's a hard protocol to build with. And I think the other thing that really held it back was the lack of EVM, right? So EVM, if you think about it, it may not be the best technology out there, but it has the most distribution, the most devs, and the most tooling, right? And that's what really sets it apart from Clarity EVM, which was like Stacks' VM or other VMs out there, right? That's where okay, if we bring EVM to Bitcoin, it just immediately unlocks access to all of these developers and all of this tooling, right? And so that was the initial insight. And then we're like, okay, then how do we build a design that actually represents this and that stays true to the ethos of Bitcoin, which is decentralization? So we do think that in the current Bitcoin layer 2 landscape, aside from maybe Lightning, which is to date the only true L2 in terms of having unilateral withdrawal, aside from Lightning and some Lightning-like competitors, right? I think we're proposing a design that is the most decentralized version that there is out there. So most designs you'll see in the Bitcoin L2 space right now are largely rollups, right? And they're built on Ethereum. And so, which is all well and good, but one, it's Bitcoin, and two, rollups inherently have a lot of centralization risk, which they accept in favor of some form of, crypto economic security, right? They're much, much faster. And that's kind of the trade-off that you make with the rollup. So we were thinking, okay, what is a design we can come up with, which is not a roll up, but which inherits a lot of that efficiency, right? And that's how my co-founder, Willem, who's the cryptographer, came up with the spider chain. So I think when we were designing the spider chain, there were three things that we were really optimizing for, right? So the first is like, what is possible in Bitcoin Core today, right? Because as I mentioned, it's a very hard protocol to build on. The second thing is one that is, decentralized at its core, and three is one that is EVM equivalent, because as I mentioned, that is the big unlock that we saw. And so we came up with the spider chain. So the best way to visualize it, it's a randomized rotating set of multisigs that are used to secure the Bitcoin, right? Or the other way to think of it is like a zoomed out version of the channels of like lightning channels or lightning factories, right? So the way that it works is, first of all, we're a proof of stake chain. So the way it works is you stake Bitcoin on Bitcoin, right? And that's what you use to secure the chain. Mm-hmm. So we're a proof of stake chain. So you stake Bitcoin on Bitcoin and you build out like this decentralized staker set with all of these node runners that would all put in, some Bitcoin stake to secure the chain. Then essentially what happens is you generate the multisig, right? And the multisig is, where the Bitcoin sits, where it's secured, right? So let's say you have multisig 1, right? So that's the first multisig. Then in order to secure that multisig, you choose 100 random participants from that overall decentralized staker set of, let's say, 10,000, right? And we're actually going to use SHA-256, which is Bitcoin's block hash rate function, which to date is the best VRF in the entire world, right? We use that as a randomization function to pick those 100 participants to secure multisig 1. And then you generate multisig 2, pick another 100 random participants.
It's getting technical, Alisia.
Oh, oops. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's okay. Yeah, I think maybe on that note, it's just kind of, where do you kind of see the purpose of spider chain going, like in the near term or long term? And like, what is the role really when it comes to like expanding Bitcoin's functionalities?
Yeah, I think the best way to, like zooming out and maybe being less technical about the spider chain.
Fine.
The best way to think of it is it's a novel, decentralized approach to scaling Bitcoin that is very different from other approaches out there, but is still very, very fast, right? So our block times are, 5 to 7 seconds. Our transaction fees are about 1 cent per transaction. So very fast, very cheap, but then inheriting most of Bitcoin security because we're inheriting it through the proof of stake. And so in that sense, you're almost operating on Bitcoin itself, but then able to do so much more because it's EVM. So opening up the entire world of DeFi and opening up the entire world of SocialFi, of GameFi, of RetailFi, everything, you can now build it on Bitcoin. So that's kind of the broader vision of what we're trying to bring to Bitcoin, right? And we truly believe that like everything you've done on Ethereum, on other chains, you can now do it on Bitcoin and have access to Bitcoin security, as well as like that massive TAM and those users, right? Because as I mentioned, there's like this specific set of users that have maybe never, ever, DeFi before that might want to do so with Bitcoin and start earning native Bitcoin yield. Because since Bitcoin's inception, you experience all of those gains largely through price appreciation, which has obviously been very, very good for a lot of people. But imagine if you can stake that Bitcoin and actually earn yield on that. And I think that's quite an attractive market. And also do all of the DeFi, build predictions markets, build a game. So it's really interesting because when I first started building out our ecosystem, my immediate thought was, let's build out DeFi, right? Let's build out all the derivatives, get the DEXs on board, get the perpetuals on board, get stablecoins on board. And we have all of that. But what's actually been so exciting and interesting for me is seeing everything else that people are building on it, right? So someone's building a social app, someone's building a prediction market, we're building like a dating app, we're building like so many really retail use cases all on Bitcoin. Just because and I think that's kind of also our broader purpose is to just make Bitcoin usable again, fun again, relevant again. And I think it has the potential to be so much bigger, especially because of that addressable market, not just the traditional Ethereum DeFi market, which if you count it at the end of the day is about 200,000 DeFi power users, right? But thinking about onboarding the next 10 million users on chain. And that's what really motivates us at the end of the day.
Where would you say the most demand is right now from retail users across all those sectors you just brought up?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think the way that we're segmenting our users is maybe a little bit different, right? So our day one users I don't think are going to be Bitcoiners, right? As someone who has a lot of experience with Bitcoiners,
Right.
There tend to be a much more skeptical class of people, right? And what they need to see is they need to see protocol stability, security, and scalability for at least 6 months before they will consider depositing Bitcoin into your protocol, right? And so that is the long-term goal, is building those real use cases for the Bitcoiners, like using your Bitcoin as collateral for a mortgage or for a loan or things like that. I do think that those are the longer-term use cases, right? The more immediate retail use cases that we're seeing, right, is the entire spectrum of DeFi, right? So being able to, use your Bitcoin to mint actual USD stablecoins, right? I think that's a pretty immediate use case we're seeing for retail. Using your Bitcoin in a perpetual stacks, using your Bitcoin in a very traditional AMM, concentrated liquidity construct. So I think every DeFi use case we're seeing is that's the more immediate use case that seems to be our day one users that are really excited about. And also, really interestingly, Bitcoiners will not deposit vast sums of capital, but I do think for predictions market, especially with the election cycle coming up, and that appealing to Bitcoiners very specifically, as you saw, a presidential candidate spoke at the Bitcoin conference. No points for guessing who. There is a very specific cultural tie between Bitcoiners and macroeconomic indicators. And so that is something that we're massively hoping to capitalize on as well, day one.
Bitcoin in the DeFi space, I think, is a pretty hot topic right now. As you mentioned, like Bitcoin L2s in itself suddenly just popped up all over the place. We don't even know, how they developed it as fast as, it took you guys 2 years. But on the front of Bitcoin DeFi, I feel like that is a big conversation as well right now. What do you think the role of that specific sector will play in the broader crypto ecosystem? Because obviously, there's Ethereum DeFi, there's Solana-based DeFi, there's other networks that have big DeFi networks. But obviously, Bitcoin is the oldest network, but maybe it hasn't had the most development. And now it's trying to hit that. So what kind of role do you see it playing in, let's say, like the near term? This podcast is sponsored by Galaxy. If you're immersed in the world of Web3, Galaxy is a name you need to know. As a decentralized super app with an impressive 21 million users boasting over 100 million monthly transactions, Galaxy is elevating its impact with Gravity, the magnet chain for Web3. Gravity is designed for full chain abstraction, zero knowledge proof-based privacy, and rapid transaction speeds, all coming together to offer an unparalleled user experience. Gravity opens the door for developers to effortlessly build on the largest on-chain distribution platform, and for users, it promises an even smoother, more secure journey through Web3. It's not about being on-chain, it's about being on the right chain every single time. Galaxy is on a mission to onboard the world to Web3, and Gravity is the magnetic force that will propel the vision forward. Ready to launch your Web3 journey? Build the future on Gravity. Visit gravity.xyz for more information.
Yeah, I think it's still very early days for Bitcoin DeFi. A lot of the Bitcoin DeFi constructs you're seeing in the market by other L2s, other DeFi projects are basically, okay, park your Bitcoin here.
Right.
We will bridge it over to other chains like Ethereum or Cosmos or Solana, and you can capture yields and bring it back to Bitcoin, right? Which is all well and good, but then again, it's
like removing it from
similar.
It. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's one, you don't inherit any Bitcoin security, and two, that's basically the model for WBTC or any of these other competitors, right? That's actually how Bitcoiners traditionally access DeFi, was through WBTC or any sort of derivative like that, right? So I do think that kind of DeFi obviously has a place if you're willing to trust those security assumptions. That's all, that's totally fine. But I don't think that is a true Bitcoin native DeFi ecosystem. And I think that's what really sets us apart. Our yield model is very simple compared to any other L2 out there. The yield on our network is generated endogenously through transaction activity and fees that is accrued on our network and then accrues back to the stakers. It's like very straightforward. That's exactly how Ethereum works, right? And I do think that in order to create that level of transaction activity and yield, you need real new projects, real use cases that actually appeal to Bitcoiners and to Ethereum users, to everybody, right? And so that's why I say it's very, very early days. People are getting very excited and they're onboarding a ton of institutional and retails. And and I kind of wish that this industry is allowed to develop a little bit more organically. And yeah, build real things for people that care instead of just copying and pasting everything that's been done before and bringing it over. And I think that's what we're doing a lot more intentionally, perhaps, than other Bitcoin teams. One, because we've also been around for so long. Like, we started building our ecosystem over a year ago. There's some builders we've been working with for over a year that, so in that sense, I think we've been a lot more intentional about really thinking through what are the implications of some of these use cases, and how to make it relevant, not just for the Bitcoiner context, but for the retail context more broadly. And again, especially for me as someone who's lived and worked across emerging markets, right. I'm extraordinarily passionate about Bitcoin for emerging markets. So as I mentioned, in a lot of the countries that I've lived in, that I've worked in, they would only touch the Bitcoin. They would not touch any other cryptocurrency, largely because of its true decentralization and the privacy component as well, right? That Bitcoin arguably offers more than other cryptocurrencies, right? And so one of the things we're really deep clicking on or diving into is, okay, what does a retail use case for Bitcoin in Uganda look like, right? How do we actually create products that make sense for that context, right? Where Bitcoin is not just an investment class, it's all they have, right? So it's a very different mentality and mindset. And I think that is like the broader market that we're also hoping to think about meaningfully and actually include them into the conversation.
Emerging markets and everything else on that front, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you brought up decentralization and security, and those are extremely important selling points and reasons to build on Bitcoin or transact on it. But what do you think are other characteristics that people should keep in mind when considering both of those things, like to transact and or build on another network? Why should they go to a Bitcoin L2?
Yeah. First of all, I think for any developer that is considering building on any chain, right, they have to do a lot of their own research and, really question the trust and security assumptions of every model that they see, right? And so I do think that our industry is driven a lot by narrative and momentum, which we've definitely benefited from this year, but we also have the docs to back it up, right? So I think the best way that what I tell all developers that are considering building on us or any other chain is, really look through the bridge design, really look through what that actually implies, right? Before deciding to build there. So I think it comes down to decentralization, it comes down to security, it comes down to momentum and activity and who else they can plug into, right? Which I think we offer more than probably many other chains. And then I think what I tell retail is like really be judicious about understanding smart contract risk, right? So one thing that we're getting all of our ecosystem teams to do is, have every single one of their smart contracts audited at least 2 times by auditors we know and trust, right? Because that is unfortunately like also reality of our industry is, to be aware and cognizant of exploits. And I do think, especially within the Bitcoin L2 land, a lot of retail has been rugged several times already, and that's just not something we ever want to be associated with or promote. And so even though we are an agnostic chain and anyone can build anything on us, we do also take some responsibility in terms of protecting our customers a little bit. Our community is very, very strong. And, again, we've been building it out for 2 years and super engaged. And so we also do feel a sense of responsibility over them and want to make sure that, they're also doing their own research before depositing their coins into any sort of protocol.
Do you see a future where Bitcoin L2s and a Spider chain would kind of cross collaborate with other chains in the broader crypto ecosystem?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of the Bitcoin L2s are already working quite well with each other. So I think there was a sense that it would be everything is, I guess, competitive, but I do think it's a much more collaborative space than I was expecting, just because Bitcoin is such a huge market. I think there's going to be multiple winners. And as such, I think we have just been a much more collaborative cohort than others. So I'm seeing a lot of bridging solutions are already existing between Bitcoin L2s and welcomed as such, right? Because there are different, obviously, liquidity and incentives within each L2. Lightning, I think, is serving as a really interesting role with Taproot Assets as potentially being one of these bridges, right? But I do think that really interestingly, we've been seeing a lot of flow of builders from like Solana, from Ton, from a bunch of these other ecosystems,
into
right?
Bitcoin L2s.
Into Bitcoin L2s from a use case basis, but from a liquidity basis and also from a user's basis. So I do think that that cross-pollination is going to keep occurring just because of the amount of captive users and liquidity there is within Bitcoin, right? It has the potential to eat up everything else. And that's what I kind of tell people. And not like, obviously there are use cases for Solana, for Ton, for everything, right? But at the end of the day, if you can bring all of that efficiency over to Bitcoin, Bitcoin will eat the world. And I think you've seen that play out a few times already. And I think it's going to continue, especially if we all do our jobs well and provide a good, secure basis for scaling Bitcoin.
So what do you think would happen to those L1s then? Like Solana, Ton, Ethereum, etc.
I don't know why anyone builds on anything other than Bitcoin, but I'm like, it's so funny. I started off with an ETH maxi.
Yeah.
I started off with Bitcoin, then obviously became like an ETH maxi. And now I'm a pretty big Bitcoin maxi because I truly think, I think Ton has very specific use cases. I think Solana has very specific use cases. Ethereum, I have a lot of respect, but I think all of that can obviously flow back to Bitcoin very easily. So I think there are use cases for a bunch of these L1s, but I don't understand why we need 10 other L1s, to be quite honest. And I think you're already seeing that infra fatigue. So I'd rather scale the best crypto instead of scale 10 other cryptos.
I think the Bitcoin ecosystem is still in its early days for the front of users and developers, etc. We talked a bit about DeFi. I'm curious if there are other sectors that you're following that are either untapped on Bitcoin right now or you see as something that will gain a lot of adoption, let's say in like the next 6 to 12 months. Yeah,
it's really interesting. I think, as I mentioned, DeFi was the immediate use case that we went after just because it made the most sense because it's like a very hard asset class at the end of the day. It makes sense that it would be used for financial use cases. I see there's a few interesting sectors that have come up. Obviously, you mentioned like the gaming, the retail angle with like predictions market and all, which has been quite appealing to Bitcoiners. But one really interesting one is real world assets, right? So I know we've all been trying to make real world assets happen for like a few years now.
Yes.
Like stop trying to make fetch happen. But I do think that real world assets, which are Bitcoin backed, have a lot of potential. Again, we're having a lot of these conversations with institutions, with some of the largest funds in the world, and they only touch Bitcoin, and they really see it as the only comparable for a lot of these TradFi assets or for all of these real world assets, right? So I think just the ability and potential to tokenize that and have it be Bitcoin backed has been huge for us. It's been a really, really interesting market for us to potentially explore. So yeah, I would say that's been one that also has been quite interesting for us to start thinking about.
And I'm sure the Bitcoin spot ETF definitely played a big role in accelerating that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing. The profile and demographic of a Bitcoiner has fundamentally changed. So there's actually a report that came out recently, which talked about, the profile of a Bitcoiner and how it fundamentally changed pre and post ETF, because now it's basically everybody. And they have a certain level of comfort in that asset class, since the spot ETF, right? And so that has obviously opened it up to so many more people, and they are willing to transform it from just, store of value to, medium of exchange to full financial instrument, right? So if you think about it, if Bitcoin is now accepted more as an actual unit of currency, right? All of those traditional financial functions that you would see in TradFi, you can now apply to Bitcoin as well, right? That is the premise for DeFi for sure, right? But I think what's much more interesting is bridging the worlds of like TradFi and DeFi, using Bitcoin as that vehicle, as one that is accepted within both of these worlds. And I think that's the line that we're now beginning to straddle, at least see within the Bitcoin L2 land.
Yeah. How do you see tokenization playing a role in that too? Because obviously real world assets is a big trend, but so is tokenization. I feel like they're usually brought together hand in hand.
Yeah, it's funny because actually I've thought about tokenization probably too much. Again, it's one of those that I've been personally trying to make happen for a few years, and it's like, I think with tokenization, right? As someone who's worked in that, right, in some previous jobs, the biggest issues were always regulation, right? Any sort of meaningful real world asset tokenization is going to be a function of the regulatory cycle that it is personally subject to. And I do think we're seeing early experiments of this around the world, not the United States, because it's going to take a while for anything of substance to occur here. But I do think you're starting to see a lot of these meaningful experiments happening in Asia and the Middle East. And I think it's going to be, I think that obviously opens it up so much more, because you also have the potential of fractionalizing a lot of these assets that never were, and making them much more subject to like a 24/7 cycle, which is also quite compelling for a lot of traders, and also just like democratizing and opening it up to so much more. So, as someone who used to work in finance, like we should be tokenizing private equity, right? It is in TradFi the best performing asset class. Why isn't that tokenized more? And why aren't more everyday investors allowed to experience that level of return, right? So I think that's another like immediate thing that we could unlock with tokenization. And again, for all of these different types of use cases, a lot the folks we've been speaking to are just much more comfortable like with Bitcoin, compared to anything else, because 100%. That's what they have the most familiarity with.
Yeah. I will say though, I think a lot of Bitcoiners out there just don't want to use their Bitcoin for anything. They see it as a store of value. They want to leave it. Are those the types of audiences that you want to try and pull in regardless, even if they have this ethos? Or are you just going to like let them be and kind of target other groups?
Yeah, I will say two things. One, I think that group is very loud and very vocal, but also very small, so I think there's this view of, what a Bitcoin maxi looks like. Like,
of course,
like literally bury their private keys in their backyard. That is a very small minority of Bitcoiners now, especially post ETF, right? I think that is a group that I find less relevant, right? Numerically. However, I do think that once they start seeing an actual Bitcoin ecosystem flourishing with security, with scalability, with stability, and they start seeing everyone else earning yield on their Bitcoin, they're going to be like, yeah, I'm literally throwing away money, right? Ethereum got to a point where it's like, if you're not staking, what are you doing, right? Like I think Bitcoin is going to get to that. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. It's very early days. And so I think once we get to that point, I think they're inevitably going to come over. But again, you need to demonstrate protocol stability, security, all of those things before you get to that point, which is why I think, it is premature. And I think it's going to take a while for them to come over. But we're hoping that they will come over once we start building out this new ecosystem and infrastructure that Ethereum already obviously benefits from.
You might have already answered this, but aside from them, what do you think every other Bitcoiner wants?
That's a great question. Again, it's hard to segment them all like into one, right? So
generalize them all.
There's Bitcoiners and there's Bitcoiners, right? If I were to think about some of the folks that go to like BitDevs and go to the Bitcoin conferences, right? And they only transact in Bitcoin and they wanted the whole world to run on Bitcoin. Actually, I want that too, right?
Of course.
I think there needs to be more, it needs to be easier to use Bitcoin, right? And I think fundamentally what L2s do is they fix a lot of UI, UX issues with using Bitcoin and make it a lot cheaper, a lot faster, a lot better. And so I do think that we fundamentally address that pain point that Bitcoin currently has. And so also in terms of just building those scalable retail use cases, that's what Bitcoiners want. And then if you think about an ETF Bitcoiner, right? Like your dad and my dad who now are exposed to Bitcoin. Actually, like not my dad, because my dad was
My dad is
Bitcoin.
Into it. Yeah. He was into it before the ETF. But yes, I know what you mean. The older generations, yes.
The older generations. Probably not anyone who's a direct relative of anyone in crypto. They probably had it shoved down their throats for like a decade, right? But what they want is they want a stable asset class that's going to give them yield, right? Those are two extreme cases. And in the middle, you have everyone else, right? You'll have the DeFi degens, you'll have the folks minting stable coins, you'll have the folks like doing like playing Bitcoin games, right? I think one narrative that I'm really excited for in crypto more generally is just to make it usable, right? Like I think we're done with chains. We're done with like new protocols.
To make it accessible.
Yeah, we just need to actually have it used by the rest of the world. And that's why I'm so excited about emerging markets, because the one unique feature, and like, again, not to generalize all emerging markets or the global south, but one unique feature that they have is their ability to leapfrog innovations, right? Because they're not burdened with legacy technologies or behaviors, right? There's a reason, like, right, mobile payments were invented in Kenya, right? So I think that's why I'm really excited about the usability of Bitcoin really coming to the fore. And I'm hoping, and I would be happy if anyone used any crypto, like Ethereum, Solana, Ton, all of these,
just to get into the space.
Everyone, people should just be should be like transacting on chain. And I think, because at the end of the day, that's what gets us closer to our crypto's eventual goal, I would say, which is, having greater financial freedom and democratization of our money and our data. And so I think I personally have a preference for Bitcoin, but I think there should be products out there for all preferences, right? So I think that's what excites me most.
Amazing. So what would you say is on the roadmap for the near term to really achieve that goal, especially at Botanix?
Yeah, so we're shipping mainnet, which is going to be our big. Yeah, so we launched our test net in November of last year, so well before this current wave of Bitcoin L2s. We were the first Bitcoin L2 that was like EVM to really come out with an end-to-end functioning testnet. And we experienced a crazy amount of traction on it. So I think we crossed like 1.5 million transactions, 450,000 users, about 20,000 contracts launched. And right now we have like about 60 teams building on us, right, ahead of mainnet. So it, honestly, for us, that already shows like the massive appetite there is for something like this. Like the fact that we had this many users, and even if you assume some of them were botted, which, obviously, it's still a pretty insane amount of users, right? And so I think that just is testament to the fact that people actually want to use their Bitcoin and do interesting things with it. And so, yeah, we're waiting to ship we're waiting to ship mainnet, which is going to happen soon, this fall. And yeah, excited to build onwards and upwards from there, and keep making our network more decentralized, because we're not to get too technical, but we're starting with federation and proof of authority, but eventually we'll want to get to the permissionless spider chain, whereby anyone in the world can run their own node. So like our goal is to be more decentralized than Ethereum itself. So working towards that end goal.
Amazing. And when is mainnet in the fall, or is just broadly the fall?
Broadly in the fall, let's just say.
Okay. Gotta ask. Last major questions for you, Alisia. What else are you watching across the crypto ecosystem right now, outside of everything we've talked about, that you think our listeners should watch out for too?
Yeah. So I think, I'm very into the Bitcoin of it all, right? So there's a few new meta protocols that I'm quite interested in. There's a few new, I guess, true L2 designs that I'm quite interested in. And in general, I'm like quite excited by a lot of the soft fork discussions happening in Bitcoin, right? So I'm sure you've heard of like OPCAT or OpCat, right? That's like one of the main Bitcoin soft fork covenants. That was actually co-written by Armin Saburi, who's one of my co-founders at Botanix Labs. So we've had like quite an insider view into that whole process, and it's been really exciting to see. But just seeing like the cultural shift that's occurring in Bitcoin from the max who never wanted to do anything and never wanted the protocol to change, people being like, oh, actually, it would be good if we enable these opcodes and could do more with our Bitcoin. That could be quite interesting. So just seeing that cultural shift in Bitcoin has been quite interesting. So that's obviously something I've really had my eye on. And two, I think, back to the whole usability conversation, I'm just really excited by anyone who gets people to transact on chain. Right? Like,
sounds simple, but it's not.
Yeah, exactly. Give me all the Ton trading bots. Like, I'll have all of them. Like, I want really cool and fun consumer use cases. Like I told you, we're going to do a dating app on our mainnet.
That.
Yeah, exactly. So I think again, to serve this broader purpose of, actually getting crypto to the masses and not the 200,000 ETH DeFi power users that rule this entire industry, right? I think we just need to get more people engaged and transacting on chain, because that's actually going to be that unlock for mass adoption, right? So any consumer retail focused application that gets people there, I think I'm pretty excited about. Like a lot of the stuff happening in Berachain, I think is super cool. I think they've been really good at building unique use cases that people are actually excited about and creating culture and community. I've been thinking a lot about this whole, culture and community perspective, like what like governs the success of one chain or one ecosystem versus another. And I think a lot of it comes down to people believing like they're a part of something. And that's really, I guess, comes down to the decentralization and DAOization of it all, right? Is how do you build something in the ether, which is what we're all kind of trying to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are like some broad concepts I'm interested in. I could get more technical into like, but I won't. Really interesting, like stablecoin design and DeFi primitives.
Yeah.
But I just think that there's a lot of cool stuff happening. I think I see the entry of institutions into the space as positive, largely positive, let's say net positive. But I do think it's something we need to be cognizant of the risks of that as well, right? Because it does also seem counterintuitive to why we're all in this industry in the first
of it all,
ethos of it all. Yeah. So I'm just in general very anarchist. And so I'm like, okay, I love the institutional money, but let's take it one step at a time, right? So yeah, that was a lot of different things, but those are things I think that excite me and that keep me engaged. And that I'm excited for, at least for us, for Bitcoin and for crypto more broadly.
Amazing. I mean, you've been in the space for a while, so it's fair to be excited by a bunch of different facets. And on that note, can you leave us with a piece of advice, something that you've carried with you throughout your time in this industry?
That's a really good question. I think the biggest thing I've learned, I guess, being in this industry for almost a decade, right, is to never take things so seriously, especially when it comes to like DeFi gains and losses and stuff, right? It's just kind of stay true to what brought you to this industry in the first place. And I mean, for me, it was very idealistic, lofty ambitions of, transforming Brazil and the world, right? And I think that's really kept me centered through the minutiae of it all. Because I do think I just also got back from a 1 week break, and I was like, I logged onto Twitter and I was like, oh, cool, like everything has changed and also nothing has changed, right?
That's such a good point. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, every day there's a new narrative. Every day there's a new hot project, a new hot protocol. But as long as you stay centered as to like what you're building and why you're building it, I think that's what's going to serve you well. And also to be nice, because there's a lot of, I think in this industry, arrogance and ego are often celebrated and rewarded. And it's, I think at the end of the day, people may forget what you do, but they won't forget how you made them feel. And so I just think there should be more kindness in crypto.
100%. I agree with you. Be kind to people.
Yeah.
Alisia, thank you so much for coming on today. We're going to have you come back after mainnet launch, and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great. It was great chatting with you, and I hope it was interesting and relevant.
100%. Thanks.